In the book of Isaiah, he says, "The wilderness and dry land shall be glad, the desert shall rejoice and bloom. Like the crocus it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing." In the midst of a gathering winter, we dare to believe that crocuses will yet again bloom. And if not today in our yard, they can bloom in our hearts. And so we gather and worship, which is why each week we say, "This indeed is a day which the Lord has made, and you must always answer, 'Let us rejoice and be glad in it.'" And so the choir will lift us together as we begin our hour of worship. Rejoice. And now it's your turn to do the rejoicing as we summon our hearts in song with our opening hymn, the traditional Thanksgiving hymn, number 67, which you find in your hymn book. We sing now together. Let's sing together. Do be seated, and aren't we lucky to have such great brass players to fortify our singing this morning? Thank you to all three of you. I'd like you to join with me now as we share these words from G.K. Chesterton as our responsive reading. There is not really any courage at all in attacking hoary or antiquated things any more than offering to fight one's grandmother. The really courageous people are those who defy tyrannies young as the morning and superstitions fresh as the first flowers. The true free thinkers are those whose intellects are as much free from the future as they are from the past. They care as little for what will be as what has been, and care only for what ought to be. Now, there's a challenge. I'm about to introduce our wonderful governing board member and choir master sublime, Patrick Eaman, who will bring the welcome. And just to remind you, while he's doing the welcome and they're singing, I'm going to go get the microphone I left in my office. So I'm vanishing, but I'm not leaving you alone, all right? Pat, can you keep them company for a few moments? Excellent. Come on up here. Let's welcome Pat Eaman, shall we?
Good morning, and welcome to Fountain Street Church. I serve on our governing board, and I wanted to speak to you today about elections. This Sunday, we are selecting the 5 members that will join the governing board in January. I want to thank those of you who helped me in the search for today's candidates. Your responses and remarks have helped me to shape a selection of capable and interesting members with the support of my committee. They will help us embrace change in the years to come and will continue with leadership in many other ways. For the nominees and all of us here today, I offer a message from Maya Angelou. You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. Also, we are in a shadow of other elections that are on our minds today. You will soon receive a ballot to select the search committee looking for our next senior minister. Please support that election as you would any other. Many of us are giving thought to the recent national election as well as the next one that seems so far away. In reading some prior sermons from our church, I was able to locate the message given here November 15th, 1964. This was the election that held the largest majority vote in a long time, reaching 60% of the popular vote, and placed Lyndon Johnson into full term of office. He had defeated Senator Goldwater in a very polar campaign. Mr. Goldwater brought opposition to a liberal awakening and stood opposed to the recently passed Civil Rights Act. Nobody could foresee the very divided nature of our politics today. From our pulpit, the message that November Sunday was titled Acceptance, Rejection, and Criticism. It was a hopeful message that asked us not to reject or ignore that which threatens us, our ideas, our pride, or our virtue. It is not possible to reject these things because they are a part of us and a part of our imperfect compromise that is inherent in each election. That November message instructed us not to reject, but to accept critically the meaning, the value of the opposition. This hopeful message asks us to be critical with our own view and the view of the others by offering the following. There is a way to the high ideals that we have dreamed about for so long, and we will find a way. Remembering these words, please join us in the months ahead. And with any luck, we'll have a following ministerial speech. Thank you.
Now, the problem is now I got to take this off, and I got to put the readings. Who said dignity had to be solemn? I have my dignity with or without a jacket. Come on. Readings. We do readings around here like a lot of churches because old words remind us that we're not so smart. There's nothing new under the sun. They also tell us to go back and think before moving ahead. If Chesterton is right that we shouldn't be, shall we say, fencing or tilting at old windmills, but rather new ones, we still benefit by learning how our ancestors fought their fights. And in my year-long study of Paul of Tarsus, St. Paul, the Apostle, whichever, I'm reading from the book of Galatians. Ooh, sorry about that. Shh. In the 2nd chapter, he's talking about his story as an apostle and how he came to be someone of authority. And he says, they recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, meaning non-Jews, just as Peter had been entrusted with the task of preaching to the circumcised, meaning the Jews. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle, was also at work in me as an apostle. James, brother of Jesus, Peter and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace, the gift given to me. I'll come back to that. As you can tell from the title, I'm going to talk about this right hand of fellowship thing and what it means. But in a more modern sense, Robert Ingersoll, who used to power through the Midwest as a notorious infidel but famously eloquent man, at one point said, "Let us forget that we are Baptists, Methodists, Catholics, Presbyterians, or free thinkers, and remember only that we are men and women. After all, a man and woman are the highest possible titles. All other names belittle us and show that we have, to a certain extent, given up our individuality and have consented to wear the collar of authority, that we are followers." Throwing away these names, let us examine these questions as not as partisans of what we are, what we belong to, but as human beings with hopes and fears in common. Okay, we'll leave those for the moment. So it's time to talk about the offering, right? Am I right? Okay. My order of service is over here. And I went up and got the microphone. I also stopped for some coffee. Decaf. And a piece of pie. Looks good, doesn't it? And does anyone eat pumpkin pie when it's not Thanksgiving or Christmas? Good for you. Good on you. And they're selling these. And we're talking about the offering now, and Pat's talked about the annual meeting, and I'm going to talk about money in the shape of pie. Okay? It's a small slice, wouldn't you say? But if you go into the social hall after the annual meeting, and you can buy a piece, how much is that worth? Are you willing to put your 50? If you are hungry and all you have is money and not food, it's worth whatever money you have in your pocket. Am I right? So its value varies depending on your state of hunger or your state of poverty or wealth. I want you to think, well, should I auction this off? What'll someone give me for this piece of pie? Does someone have a buck? Say what? Say that again. I want to hear a bid for the pie. Come on. $2. Is that a $2 slice of pie? You are cheap. If I were to tell you that whoever eats this pie will save someone from starving, how much is it now worth? How much? Yeah, it was worth more. We're going to take the offering in a moment, and if someone wants to walk up here and hand me something larger than a 20, you can have this piece of pie and eat it right here. You can't have the coffee, sorry. But if you don't, I want you to estimate that your pleasure and someone else's need are exactly as important as one another. And so I want you to esteem the other person's need as worth your pleasure as well, whether it's a $2 piece of pie, handmade, by the way, or a $100 piece of pie, your decision. But your offering that goes beyond this church, that feeds, nourishes, cares, warms, clothes, advocates, witnesses, promises, that offering is worth a whole lot of pie, I think. And we'll now take it. And like I said, if you got a 50 or $100, it's yours. That means it's time for the offering. Give money, make music. That was great. Love the music. Speaking of the music, I was so tickled to hear the choir sing the Largo from Handel's Xerxes. That's an aria, by the way, from an opera that is almost never performed. Handel, as the opera writer, is almost overlooked. He wrote a bunch, including Julius Caesar, and this one is about Xerxes, the emperor of Persia. And that's the very first piece in it, as I remember, one of the very first. And in fact, in its original form, Xerxes is sleeping off a lot of booze. And he is telling a tree how much he loves it. One would have to be a lot of booze. At any rate, very different from the text you sang, right? My point as we approach the time of prayer and meditation is that sometimes something can take on many can be a vessel for many things. That music can hold different words. The words we heard were much more solemn and reverent, and the music really suits it. You never thought of it as being the song of a drunken emperor, but it's also the song of a pious heart. And in this case, the song of an impious heart, because, well, gee whiz, it was 1977, 40 years ago. I was a student minister, and a little over 40 years ago, and I've told this story before, but it's worth retelling, and I somehow came to call upon an aging and eventually dying physician, pathologist, who had served during World War II. He was in his 80s already in 1970-something, so he was someone who served during the war as a physician, and he was a Jewish man by birth, and he was among the first to see the camps before anyone truly knew. And it broke his faith forever. He could not accept that there could be a God that would allow such horror to take place. And he became a convinced, devoted, and fervent atheist. Now, he could be right about the atheism, but I think it was premised on a feeling that was so profound that he could not accept any other explanation, or any explanation at all. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, when I went to visit him, he would argue with me constantly about this. That was his pleasure. But now and then he was kind of tired. And he asked me to sit at the piano and play a piece of music, and that's the piece of music he had me play. And as I played that piece of music on a rather old piano, and not nearly as well as Cameo did, I saw him at peace. That's what music can do. It can go beneath words, beyond words. It can speak to our souls, our hearts, without a single syllable, can't it? I want us to think of the moment of prayer as being a tune that you hum in your head. Do you have a song you hum all the time? I have an earworm. You do too. And so instead of me saying holy words, we're going to let a little silence sit here so inside your head you can hear the tune, the melody, the music that keeps you going. And after church, if you want to tell me what that tune is, I would consider it a very great honor, because we rarely tell each other exactly what fortifies us. By the way, for me, it's Henry Purcell, but that's another matter. I didn't choose it. It just happened. That's how it happens. So, take a breath. Let the breath go, and let your inner music take you to that place that you know is holy. And so may it be, and amen. And now let the music that we hear with our ears accompany the music we hear with our hearts. you may be too embarrassed to pay for your pie. However, if you catch me after church and you don't want anyone to see you handing over so much money, it's yours. To preach is a daring act and a foolish one, which is why I ask the blessing not only of those in this room, but those who built this room and lived here and conducted their lives here, for their memory brings blessing and hope to us all. I lift up the names of those whose lives ended at this time in years past, of Virginia Hewitt and Barb Kepler, Jan DeWitt and Bill Gedris and Fran Burkholder and Paul Bowers, and just this week, Robert Bears. El Malay Rachamim, Shokim Barachamim, God filled with mercy, dwelling in the heavens heights, bring proper rest beneath the wings of your Shekhinah to the souls of our beloved who have gone to their eternal place of rest. May you, who are the source of mercy, shelter them beneath your wings eternally, bind their souls to you and to we the living, that they may rest in peace, that we may be at peace. And let us say, amen. Sauerkraut. I want you to remember the word. I said it aloud, sauerkraut. No Thanksgiving dinner is complete without sauerkraut at the table. I'm not getting any nods of agreement here because that's a local custom in my family and in my region. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, and that's what you do when you live in Central Maryland. You got to have the turkey, the stuffing, the cranberry sauce, and the sauerkraut. Gravy, yes, but after that, it doesn't matter. It could be any other dinner. If you don't have the sauerkraut, it's not Thanksgiving. And I'm guessing that there are things on your table that have that quality too. Whatever they are. Maybe it's that green bean casserole with the cream of mushroom soup and the French fried onions on top. If it's your holy dish, may it be, but not mine. Sweet potatoes, even if you only eat them once a year, they got to be there, and you only eat a spoonful, and they sit in the refrigerator for 2 weeks after that. Maybe you're a partisan of the Jell-O salad in the ring with the fruit inside, or maybe the tomato aspic with the ring of mayonnaise around it. And of course, the pumpkin pie, which, by the way, is now more expensive than it was 20 minutes ago. What is traditional at your table does vary from place to place. As I said, sauerkraut is my tradition. You have yours. But traditional foods are important on traditional occasions like Thanksgiving or Christmas or Passover or whatever. They are ones that have to be eaten or it's not quite the holiday. And ironically, they're also foods that we almost never eat any other time. Following this service, we will engage in another tradition, the annual meeting of this church, which may not be as tasty as pumpkin pie, but it is important nonetheless and a ritual of its own. You will hear reports. There will be officers and people elected. We will attempt to use Robert's Rules of Order and fail. We will go through the ritual of democracy in miniature. Thanksgiving dinner or annual meetings are but two of dozens of traditions we observe. They could be personal, like which way do you brush your teeth in the morning? They could be national, as in the first Tuesday after the first Monday when you go to your polling place. Football isn't official, but if you don't see some on Thanksgiving, you're somehow dodging the traditional bullet. And Thanksgiving Day parades, which used to be commonplace around the country and always ended with a Santa Claus that led you into the department store. Well, they've all vanished thanks to television, but we will gather around the tube and worship honorably at Macy's, which is now called Macy's Day Parade, as though somehow the holiday has become a creature of Macy's themselves. Traditions are everywhere, and you have to ask, why do we have them? You just go through the motions. Well, if you know the Fiddler on the Roof, which sadly was in the news this week as some foul-tempered and ill-mannered and vile person interrupted it with an anti-Semitic slur, you may remember that it starts with Sholem Aleichem's character, Tevye the drayman, a poor dairyman. And in the version on Broadway, he starts the show with these words, "A fiddler on the roof." Sounds crazy, no, but in our little village of Anatevka, every one of us is a fiddler on the roof trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune without breaking his neck. It isn't easy. You may ask, why do we stay here if it's so dangerous? We stay here because Anatevka is our home. And how do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word: tradition. Because of our traditions, he says, every one of us knows who he is and what God expects him to do. Without our traditions, our lives would be as shaky as a fiddler on the roof. I think sociologists would agree with Tevye the drayman. Traditions give structure to life, a sense of belonging, a hope for a larger purpose than your own being. But we all know that traditions can also imprison us. After the First World War, the story is told, they called in an efficiency expert to improve the Austrian army. And so he went to watch the artillery try shooting a weapon off. And the efficiency expert watched as 6 men gainfully loaded it up and prepared it. And then in the middle of the process, 2 men went and stood at attention, depriving the team of 2 people when it could have gone faster with all 6. After going through the ritual, he asked, well, why did you 2 stand over there doing nothing? He said, oh, we're holding the horses. Of course, this was after World War I, when they were no longer using horses. An example of a tradition that outlives its utility, but nonetheless confines us in our capacity. True, all traditions have reasons, and those reasons turn into customs, and the customs turn into traditions, and eventually traditions, unchallenged, become orthodoxy, by which means you must do them, whether or not you understand them, whether or not they do any good. And far from giving us structure and purpose, they become prisons that confine and define. That's very much a part of the story of this church, which, even as a Baptist church, pressed the traditions beyond the usual ones. Where else could you go 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even today, to hear a preacher question not only the dogmas of the Bible, but the very idea of God while Jesus watches him from the ceiling? We question traditions and we affirm them at the same time. And if that seems incongruous, the wisdom of a great biblical scholar, Yaroslav Pelikan, comes to mind as I thought about this. I'll share it with you. He defined tradition, quote, as the living faith of the dead, and traditionalism as the dead faith of the living. You can hear the difference. The liberal church, of which we are one, is a commitment to the persistent and consistent discernment of the two, to find the living faith that has propelled us from the past into the present, and to expunge and demolish the dead faith that the living succumb to. Which brings me to Paul and that passage from Galatians. His letter contains the basis for the entire Protestant Reformation, for he speaks there of being justified by faith, not by acts. There's no more orthodox idea in Protestantism than you are justified by faith, as if anyone actually understood that phrase. But it's very key. And it's now my opportunity to tell Luther and Calvin that they were wrong. They are not paying attention, by the way, but perhaps you are, and that will be of value. Paul does raise a valid point, but we understand it wrongly. He is writing in this letter to scold the new Christian communities. They're not even called Christian communities or churches yet. They're just gatherings of Jesus-following people. And he's telling them they're backsliding because some other evangelist came along and said, well, if you really want to follow Jesus, you'd keep kosher, you'd observe the Sabbath, and men, I'll meet you behind there with my knife. And Paul was preaching a different message. He was preaching that non-Jews could be Jesus followers along with Jews. That's very difficult to comprehend, and it was the single most divisive issue in the young community of Jesus' followers. Now, there's not enough time to get into all the weeds about this, but the short version of Paul's argument is that it is not the actions required by Torah that make you righteous, justified, but your loyalty to the God who gave you the laws in the first place. Paul uses Abraham as an example, whom he said was reckoned as righteous, meaning justified, before the arrival of the Torah, which came 500 years later. The law, by which he means the Torah, is a commitment between God and Israel, a contract. You do this and I'll do that. Non-Jews, in fact, are not even allowed to take part. You're either all the way in or not in at all. It's a little bit like marriage. For most people, two people are contracted together, and you don't invite others in. It gets a little messy. Paul was saying that traditions alone are no longer enough. If you follow the law and forget why you're following the law, traditions lose their meaning. We've all operated and seen that happen. You end up holding horses long after they've been led out to pasture. Paul says the law is more like a teacher, a pedagogue, someone who brings you up and shows you the way, but in time you grow up and you can move on. For Paul, and I emphasize for Paul, I'm not advocating for him, but just explaining how he gets misunderstood. The time for getting rid of the pedagogue had come because Jesus' life and death and resurrection was the signal of a new age. So we should stop obeying the law, right? We can do anything we want. Now, if you love Jesus, eat all the pork you like. You don't have to do any, well, no. He'll deal with that issue in the letters to the Corinthians. Because then some people really were deciding, hey, I'm already saved. Let's say we have a party. No. We do what the law says, whether it's Jewish law or Roman law or human law, not for its own sake, but because we are committed to the one who is dear to us, whether it is a partner, whether it's a sovereign God. If you're married, this is a great analogy. You promise at some level that the only person you will be intimate with is that person. That's what fidelity means, we think it is. You're the only intimate partner in my life. And for a long time, you may go along and do that, but chances are you'll think, you'll say, no, I don't want to get caught. I'll hurt someone's feelings. It'll bring shame upon the family. I'll get divorced. You see the costs of betraying, so you follow that rule more because of the cost of not following the rule. But at some point, if you're lucky enough to stay married long enough, and saints be praised, I have, you are faithful because you want to be, because that person's value to you is so high. Their respect is so important. Their person is so precious that you would never want to do anything that would bring them harm. So you're actually following the law, but for two different reasons. And Paul is pointing to that first version, or shall we say the second, that you should observe the law because you love God, because you love your community, because they matter to you. It is not whether, but how. And that is the difference between tradition, the living faith that connects you to the past, to the things that matter, and traditionalism. I've got to do it, otherwise people will not like me or I'll get into trouble. Now, this brings me to that wonderful little ritual I mentioned in the reading. There is Paul, along with those other guys, and they exchange the right hand of fellowship. This became a practice among Protestants, especially New England Puritans, from which all Baptists, Congregationalists, Unitarians, and Universalists have their origins. And it is something that an elder or a previous clergy person will offer a new clergy person who is entering into the community of clergy. And it is meant to signify welcome into that community, but also mutual obligation. Believe it or not, it is a wonderful Reformed theologian, Herman Nicholas Redobos, who says the right hand of fellowship in this case is a covenant as real as the one between Israel and God, a commitment to be together. Now, I'm telling you this because 38 years ago in October, this past October, I was ordained. And a colleague I knew who had served that church 25 years before me gave me the right hand of fellowship. I don't know who gave it to him, but there's a good chance it goes all the way back to John Cotton and Increase Mather. 300 years. And I wouldn't be surprised if those immigrants hadn't taken it from some other Anglican fellow who got it from some Catholic fellow. There is a real chance that the custom has endured from this first telling in the book of Galatians. When people ask, what is it like to be a clergy person, I say it is to stand in a community that precedes you by 2,000 years and to live a life that will be worthy of those 2,000 years hence. To be governed by that sense of obligation, willing obligation, eager obligation to live up to the terms that they live by. A few years ago, I was asked to give the right hand of fellowship to a colleague, and I told her of how I came to get it, where it came from. And this lovely woman, Jamaican, as dark as mahogany, beautiful beyond belief, I told her that this handshake I was giving her goes all the way back to the very first century. And she said she has never forgotten that moment any more than I have. That is a true tradition. It is the living faith that was given to me that I hand on to others. In a few moments, we'll begin our annual meeting, and like so many meetings, it will be rather perfunctory in some ways, and we'll make some mistakes in procedures, and we'll wonder what we're doing, and someone will call the question which no one ever understands, or someone will, it doesn't matter. It will not be an elegant exercise. It never is. Democracy is a messy process. But I remind you that it was a messy process that called me into this pulpit 14 years ago in October, that called David Rankin to this pulpit in 1982, that called Duncan Littlefair to this pulpit in 1944, that called Milton McGarrell, that called Alfred Wesley Wishart, that called John Herman Randall. It is your power in the messiness of that meeting, your tradition, that has empowered every preacher in this house. And we all stand as colleagues in service to you. It was this messy process that gathered and built this building after the previous one perished in a fire. Do not underestimate the power of your tradition, no matter how inglorious it may look. It is your power, your tradition, that united the quarreling Baptists that even formed Fountain Street Baptist Church in 1869. A hand in fellowship, a hand in voting, a simple act. And we make a world. We create a church. We sustain a faith. Sounds crazy? No. May these words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my redeemer. Price is going up, people. Gets higher every 10 minutes. I invite you now to lift your voice in song. It is a tradition in this church not to be very good at it. I'd like to make that into traditionalism. Let's get better at singing hymns. This is a house of joy, and joy comes through our mouths as we sing. What are we singing, Ms. Marilyn? Now thank we all our God with heart and hand and voices. Let's do that, shall we? Number 32, a traditional hymn for this time of year. Rise, sing lustily and with joy. For you shall go out in joy, says Isaiah, and be led back in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall burst into song, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. That is, if we remember that this day and every day is a day which the Lord has made, let us ever rejoice and be glad in it. Go in peace and with thanksgiving. Amen and amen.